ahead.
All right. Well, so I was asked to talk about cover crops. I heard the nice segue into that with the discussion at the end there. And there's some particular opportunities for using cover crops in the reduced tillage system. So hang on a second, I need to fire mine up to go along. So I'm just going to say next slide when we switch slides for whoever's controlling the main display. So we'll go to the next slide. So that some of the main reasons you use cover crops in general is to have cover during periods of erosion. The wind and water erosion on Long Island came up just a moment ago, and that's a good example. They're good at suppressing weeds during seasons when weeds grow eagerly. Tilth improvement is a really big reason why people use it, and also for suppression of soil-borne pests. And of these, one that plays the biggest role, I think, for reduced tillage is for tilth improvement, because the cover crops are doing some of the work that you would normally do with your tillage equipment. So on the next slide, I've drawn a picture of the reduced tillage situation. So this is in my little diagram. You've got undisturbed soil, and then in the lighter brown, that's your slot, right? So this is looking from the side underground. I work a lot on roots, so putting the root surface at the top of the slide is normal for me, but it may take a moment to adjust to that. So for erosion protection, you want sometimes cover crops that give you a light residue on the surface of the soil. You were just talking about the heavy residue of rye, but having a light residue is something that can be very useful. Because you're driving on it all the time, it's helpful to have a matrix that holds the soil together so that it supports your equipment better without compacting. So that's one important role that cover crops can play. You were just talking about the question of having the slot close up enough but not too much, and with heavier soil that sometimes the fall is the right time. But if you're on a sandy soil, you really have to prepare it in the spring because it's not going to stay open very long. So you have a lot of considerations that you're taking into account to manage that slot so when you plant, it's in the right shape for your seeds to take off. And for situations where you're preparing in the fall, you may be getting that slot prepared, but you have the opportunity to have a lot of erosion and consolidation happen in the slot, and then it's not really where you want it to be in the spring. So there's a role for cover crops in overwinter slot management. As you go deeper in the soil, if you get compaction, and inevitably you get deep compaction because conditions aren't always perfect when you drive there, that you need to make holes, basically. And cover crop roots can do that for you. Since you're not going to put a shank down in the other parts of the field, you can use cover crops to do that. And finally, it's useful to get nitrogen down in the rest of the soil zone as well. And to some extent, cover crops can help you do that, so your crop roots have more places to go looking for their fertilizer. So I'll talk through those, how to do that. And on the next one, as you're looking for a light surface residue, you want a somewhat mature tissue. If it's really green, it'll break down right away and won't last. And you want a moderate biomass. So again, the discussion just before on the rye, where you have a high biomass, there are a lot of questions about the challenges of dealing with that if they get detached or aim in different directions, or keep the ground too wet or too cold, or host slugs, or all kinds of interesting things that you might need to deal with if you have heavy biomass. If you have moderate biomass, those are much smaller issues. And the candidates for doing that is a small grain, but in that case, killed relatively small. So not letting it go to heading stage at all, but maybe 8 or 10 inches tall. And another one is annual ryegrass. that's planted in a somewhat different season. It doesn't take off on you the way a small grain can, and it makes for a finer biomass material. It doesn't last as long once you've killed it. So the next goal, the matrix for support. So the characteristics you want to have that matrix to really make a network that holds the soil particles together, you want a lot of rooting near the surface. And you want those roots to be pretty tough after they're dead. And so strong rooters, so turf grasses are a great example of this. This is one of the reasons you have grassed driveways and alleys and that sort of thing. So annual ryegrass is the cover crop that is the most turf-like, that establishes quickly and can be used in that system. The smaller grains do it not quite as well, but they're easier to establish, so there may be an opportunity there. And Sudan grass does the dense rooting near the surface and has really tough roots when it's dead. The challenge that you might have, the reason for the question mark, is that they also have pretty substantial crowns, and that may be too big for other operations that you're doing in that system. So that may or may not work. It certainly will provide a good matrix and pretty tough roots. So moving on to the next management goal, relieving compaction. The first quality, of course, that the cover crop has to have is that it tolerates that compaction, that it will grow through the compacted soil and actually put holes in it. It also needs to naturally go deep. So something like the annual ryegrass that's making a dense root mass near the surface is completely useless for this purpose. You want something that wants to go down no matter what. It wants to keep going down, 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 so that it penetrates the plow pan in many places. So you want actually a lot of roots that are going deep, so it makes many holes. And you need them to be pretty thick. So that if a really fine root goes through, it doesn't do you a lot of good. You want enough space that an earthworm can sneak through, that water can drip through, the air can go through, and that crop roots and that you're growing next can go through. So by thick roots, something on the order of 1/10 of an inch or maybe even a little bit smaller than that is just fine. So they don't need to be 2 inches. You don't need a hole that big. So there's more options. So you see the candidates number 1, radish. That's obviously the 2-incher if you've seen any of the abundant press that tillage radishes have gotten in the last year or so. They make gigantic holes at the top. And they make smaller holes at the bottom, and they are very good at going down deep. But there are some other things that you may find as attractive or even more attractive. Forage turnips. Once you're down where that plow pan would typically be, their roots are about the same diameter as radishes. So even though they don't make the same big hole at the top, if you're interested in how many holes are they actually making in the plow pan, they're going to be competitive with the radish, and they're going to grow longer into the fall. And mustards are very easy to use, and they also do a good job. Their roots aren't quite as thick, but they're also very determined to go deep. So on the next slide, managing that slot. So this is something that you would plant. You would be making that slot in the fall. You're concerned that that slot needs some protection in order to be in the right condition in the springtime. And for that, you need something that winter kills fairly late in the winter, so that it's holding the soil together as long as possible. But you want those roots to be pretty succulent. So unlike the matrix, you want these to decompose quickly, because you're not trying to hold that slot together. You're trying to turn it into a seed bed. You're trying to run the planter through there. You don't want to be having to cut through a lot of tough roots. So you want those to decompose by the time you plant. So here again, I've put radish as the first candidate, and it's very good at decomposing. It'll be completely gone by planting time in the spring. It doesn't do so well in the winter killing late. It's the first of the crucifer cover crops to die in the winter. That's part of the reason it's so well decomposed by the spring, so that's a trade-off. But it may not be holding the shallow part of the slot as well as some of the others. And so I've put turnip and rapeseed in here. They're really fairly comparable, relatively inexpensive if you go to a supplier of forage seed. And they're going to winter kill about this time of year. In fact, today was probably pretty hard on them. But if they die now, they're kept in the freezer and stay nice and green until the snow is gone, temperatures get up closer to freezing, and then they decompose, and you'll have had the soil held together a lot longer through the winter and into the spring. And they may keep the slot soil in a better condition. But in all of these cases, they should be dead and gone and decomposed, and you should just have nice soil by the time you go to plant in that slot. So then on the next slide, we'll think about how do you sneak some nitrogen into that untilled soil using the cover crop. So in terms of qualities, it doesn't really matter to you whether they're fixing nitrogen or scavenging nitrogen that has gone deep below the root zone or is left behind after your previous crop. Those are both perfectly fine ways to get the nitrogen and to put it in the form of organic nitrogen that's going to become mineralized for the crop during the year. So in this, winter killing late is actually quite important, because if you have something like the radish that dies in December, when you get the snow melt, a lot of that is just going to flush on through. It will have decomposed into soluble nitrogen forms already by the time that happens. So you do want winter killing later in the season so the nitrogen is still there, but you still want it to decompose well. You're not interested in having it be nitrogen for next year. You want it to be nitrogen this year. So the first candidate here is a nitrogen fixer, the hairy vetch. Hairy vetch does just about all of its nitrogen fixing in May. Once it starts to flower, you get a decline in the nitrogen fixing. So really, the timing for controlling hairy vetch is a pretty narrow window at the end of May. But it will have nitrogen not only in the abundant tops, but it will have been sending nitrogen to the roots. And it's really the nitrogen in the roots that's going to be the big supply. So killing the hairy vetch very early in its flowering is the stage that would let you put vetch root nitrogen into the untilled parts of the soil. And then going with the nitrogen scavengers that will be dying at the right time of year are, again, the turnip and the rapeseed. And being coal crops, they're heavy feeders. They're going to suck up any nitrogen that's sitting around in the soil available for leaching or crops. But they also end up being quite succulent, and so they will decompose. They'll have roots throughout that untilled layer, like we saw in the previous couple of slides. They'll penetrate the untilled part just fine. They have tough roots for doing that. And so the nitrogen that is in those roots will remain in the soil, and you'll be having a supply of nitrogen and a reason for your crop roots to be rummaging around in that untilled layer that you've been working hard to establish good tilth in. So I want to move on to how you manage these cover crops. I basically identified the selection of the cover crops, but thinking of how you manage them and what's special about the reduced tillage system. So there's really two steps in management that we want to be concerned about. How do you establish the cover crop well without tillage, and how do you kill it? So I'll start with the establishment on the next slide. Obviously, it's harder to get the seed into ground that you haven't tilled, or that you may have prepared a slot, but you really did that for the crop next year, so it's not in ideal conditions when you're looking at the cover crop in the late summer or fall. So getting something that will have those seeds make good soil contact and absorb water is the question. So the no-till drill, very heavy, expensive piece of equipment. You need to have ideal soil conditions before you want to bring something that big onto the ground. But they do a perfectly fine job of putting particularly things like small grains or Sudan grass in the ground. Frost seeding is something that you can't do every year, but it can actually work pretty nicely with mustard would be the one of these. And that's if you're going to have the cover crop in there just for a short time in the early spring, if you're planting later in the in late May, June. With those, when you need bare ground or just a little bit of light recent snow on top, and that you'll have a number of freeze-thaw cycles. It's the freeze-thaw cycles basically you get fairly large ice crystals forming in the top, making a hole in the soil. When that ice melts, you get a mustard seed-sized hole left behind where it melted, and the mustard seed drops down. That's basically the process that makes frost seeding work. And it works on bare ground, or if you have very, very slight residue on the ground, that can work even if you haven't tilled it. So it's a fairly specialized situation, but that's something that can be done. And then what I've called surface tillage, so the airway is probably the most common tool to do this. But in essence, you're making little slots in the surface. You're not tilling, it's just very, very superficial. But making little slots so that you can come through with a, oftentimes spinning on, it makes a little place where that seed can land and have seed soil contact. And with that one, combining that with a manure application really improves establishment of the cover crop and provides some nitrogen for your next year's crop also. The cover crop will help hold that manure nitrogen where it's going to be crop available. On the next slide, we'll look at killing the cover crop. So by and large, you want to kill the grasses with an herbicide. Most of them are not going to be dying from winter kill, that you need an herbicide to get them dead at the time that they need to be starting to decompose. With many of these, if you go early, a superficial disking, so it's not an airway, but the challenge with that is when you're going shallow and cutting across, it's easy to get survivors. You have to kill all of them. You don't have to go deep usually to kill them, but you do have to get all of them. So it's not easy to pull off, but for certain situations, that's the way to go. And winter kill with the crucifers I talked about, or with sorghum Sudan grass, works great. Having the cover crop's winter hardiness match the typical winters at your location is the main thing you have to do. So for instance, the dwarf Essex rapeseed overwinters fine in southeast Pennsylvania, Long Island. It does not overwinter here. So how you would choose the right variety for your location is actually quite important for getting that to work. But if you do that right, it works great. And then mowing and rolling, you were just discussing. I'm not going to say too much about that. Having things die, well, for both of those, to my mind, you're looking at very late plantings if you're waiting until they're big enough to be killed by mowing and rolling. That's the biggest drawback of those, is you're looking pretty late in the season. But those are with small grains and with the vetch, the hairy vetch. Those are techniques that are fairly widely used. People have figured out how to get it to work in their system. So with the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about these specific cover crops a bit more. So with the yellow mustard, The spring seeded situation, I told you about the frost seeding of that. That is definitely the way to do it. You can use a grass seeder to get it in by mid-April, but if you can get it frost seeded, you'll get a lot more biomass. And the time to kill it is right as it's flowering. That's when you get the biggest weed suppression benefits. That's how you avoid having mustard become a weed in your fields. And with this one, herbicide is way better. Cultivation, mowing, you have too many survivors, and the volunteer mustards get to be a problem. So with this spring situation, an herbicide application is really in order. So yellow mustard can also be used in the fall, and that's the situation we're using an airway and manure. You can even mix the mustard seed in the manure. If you have a tank that's agitated, you just dump the seed in at the rate you've calculated. And it goes with the manure, hits the slots that the airway created, and you get a really nice stand, and there's lots of nitrogen for the mustard to grow, and you get big biomass. It's really very nice. We're talking about a late August event here in general. Yellow mustard bolts, you can see the tall plants on the right there. Once they've bolted, they reliably winter kill. With the late August planting date, they'll flower in the fall, but by the time they flower in October, it's too late for them to make seed. So that actually ends up working nicely. You don't have the volunteer problem. Those stems end up holding the snow. So you see the snow in the picture there where those stems are. That's a picture in December, so the leaves are still on them. Those are completely decomposed. It's just tan stalks in the spring, but they will continue to hold snow into the spring. But the residue is very brittle, so once you get out in the field, those go right over. It's not like dealing with rye residue at all. Next are its relatives, turnip and rapeseed. They're really quite, the forage forms are closely related. The difference is that the turnips make about a 2-inch turnip, and the rapeseed starts to bolt a little and makes maybe a 6 or 8-inch stem. Both of those events are what make them susceptible to winter killing. They have tough roots. That's what's really nice about those. They go deep, they pull up a lot of nitrogen, and so you get your compaction relief, but then you get a lot of decomposition. So in the lower right-hand corner there, you see a little network of stuff. That is early April. That's what it looks like in early April. There's really very minimal residue with these when they've winter killed. And so the ground is starting to show clearly. So you don't have to worry about worry about having too much residue. If you need the ground to dry, to warm up in the sun, that's going to happen just fine. You get some suppression of the spring germinating cool season annual weeds, which is nice, but it may not be a real big benefit. Those are often easily controlled by other means too, but if that's useful to you, that's often one of the outcomes. The next one is the big star of 2010, tillage radish. So on the left there, those are the big radishes sticking out of the ground. It's a lot of fun to go see those. On the right is more typically what you would see in a field where you've planted radish. They're planted at a fairly low density. You can actually see a few spots of soil sticking through there. And you want that. You want the plants to be big. You want them to go deep. You don't want a lot of little ones. And if you plant at too high density, you even get a lot of suppression. That if you plant twice as many, you don't get twice the weight. You don't even get the same weight. You get less weight produced by these, and they end up shallow. So you want a fairly low seeding rate on the tillage radishes to get them to do their thing. So good nitrogen scavengers, real early winter killers. So again, places like Long Island, that may work out perfectly. But if you're looking at cooler areas of New York and Vermont, probably even western Massachusetts, then they're going to be dying quite early. And the next one, finally, or not the last one, but switching to the legume, hairy vetch. So in my scheme of cover crops, this is when you need nitrogen fixation and you're sowing in the fall. This is the one you go with. It really needs to have some sort of a nurse crop to do well, and oats is probably the most popular candidate for that because the oats will winter kill and you only end up with the vetch in the springtime if you're looking for a lot of nitrogen. It's a good companion with rye, but then rye is the main crop. That's not for growing hairy vetch, that's for making the rye decompose. So really a nurse crop would be something like oats to get it going. You would kill it in late May. So if that's too late for you, that would be a problem. There's 2 new varieties out that came out of a USDA-led breeding program. Cornell was involved with these. They're called Purple Bounty and Purple Prosperity. They give you a week or 10 days earlier bloom so you can kill them. Then that's very helpful. If you raise small grain crops, hairy vetch has hard seed. That seed will germinate in subsequent years. So you'll have hairy vetch coming back. With small grains, those volunteers will make seed exactly the same size as wheat at exactly the same time as wheat, and it's very hard to clean it out, and the mills don't like it, so they'll reject your crop. So you don't want to set yourself up for that, so that's the warning. Then on the next is annual ryegrass. So annual ryegrass is one that broadcasts very well. It's a small grass seed, but it will take broadcast on the surface in many conditions. And really anytime there's moisture on the soil, it will go, but usually in August, early September, it works really nicely. You have to kill it in the spring so it doesn't go to seed or continue to grow in your crop. And that can be a little bit tricky. To be susceptible to glyphosate, it needs to be growing pretty well so that it's moving the glyphosate around the plant. It's not living off the reserves and just making more leaves, because then the glyphosate doesn't really end up where it needs to go to kill the thing. So you have to wait until the air is warmed up and the cover crop has started to grow before the glyphosate will really take, and it may take a couple of shots to get it to die. So survival, reseeding. If it's older, the ground gets a little bit clumpy because of the crowns. Those clumps are good in the untilled parts of your reduced tillage system. They're not so good in the slot. So you may want to do some planning there as far as where that ryegrass ends up growing. Next are the smaller grains. So I've already said some things about those. So the oats will winter kill, so they give you that nice light residue on the surface from a fall crop. The rye is really forgiving as far as the conditions and timing of planting in the fall, but in the spring it can get away from you. So unless you really know what you're doing with the tall rye crop and know how to handle all that material and find your slots and get the crop planted in it and have the ground warm up. Some people do that very well. If you don't know how to do that, 4 to 6 inches tall, just that you see that mat in the bottom half of the picture there. That's what it looks like before it starts to grow. That'll turn green and hop up very quickly, and that's about the time you would want to be hitting it with an herbicide to stop it growing and leave the residue and let the roots decompose, and then you can come in and use that as a nice base for planting into the slot. So to summarize, how do you decide what you're going to do? First of all, you need to know what you're trying to accomplish. I went through a number of different things that you may need in a particular season for your reduced tillage to work better. So when you know what you want to do, find what, in general, the candidates are that might do that thing. Then you need to think about the constraints of using that particular cover crop. So if you're growing a lot of cabbage and broccoli, you probably are not that interested in radishes and turnips. So there, you may not be able to plant some of these cover crops with the equipment that you have. So you select an appropriate cover crops given those constraints. So that's the process I would go through to decide. And on the final slide, the website covercrop.net is where I have information, including a selection tool, that will help you go through that decision process. And you don't have to look things up all over the place. It's compiled all the information you need to make those decisions in one place, and even put things side by side. So thanks very much. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thomas, Anu's here. I'm going to look in Ithaca. If anyone has any questions for Thomas? Nope. All right. How about in Massachusetts?
Anybody have questions for Thomas? Nope. Oh, wait.
Thomas, what did you consider a low seeding rate for the tillage radish?
Yeah, so with the tillage radish, 7 or 8 pounds. So the seed salesmen sometimes recommend higher rates than that. Some of the literature does, but in recent work, going down to 7 pounds has given only benefits and no disadvantages.
Great. How about out in western New York, Carol? Question?
Oh, Thomas, how about annual ryegrass sprayed with gramoxone?
I don't know the answer to that question. It's a good question, and I simply don't know when that's susceptible and how much.
Thomas, could you repeat the question? I don't know if we could all hear.
Sorry. The question was using gramoxone to kill annual ryegrass. So somebody with experience might actually know that here.
One comment is that you need nitrogen in the soil in order to get those crucifers to grow really well.
That is certainly true. So if you're coming in after something that's been harvested green where you have a lot of residual nitrogen, they will often do fine on the residual nitrogen. But if you've harvested a crop that's gone to maturity and you no longer have residual nitrogen in the soil, they will take some nitrogen to get them going. We found that we get bad growth with none and decent growth with 25 pounds or so of nitrogen, so it doesn't have to be a lot. You don't have to follow the recommendation of the mustard growers to put on 125 to 140 pounds of nitrogen. Not that you're likely to do that anyway, but that's also the situation where if you're doing manure applications, that's a good combination on those. Sorghum Sudan grass that I only mentioned briefly is another one that really needs some residual nitrogen or a little start to get it going in order to give you what you need. Thanks, Carol.
Great. How about Jeff Miller? Any questions at your location?
One of the growers had a question about, what was the question, Mike? Turnip?
How early in the fall will the turnips die?
How early in the fall
Upstate New York.
will the turnips die in upstate New York, like central New York?
Right. If you have a big turnip, a 2 or 3 inch turnip, they seem to die in January and February. So days like today, when we have particularly cold spells, that's when that turnip itself freezes. The meristem may survive. And the very small plants may survive a little bit longer, but it's basically right about now that they're being killed. If you look at them, they look fine. But they would look fine if you stuck them in your freezer, too. It's after you take them out that they look bad. So there are parts of them that are still alive, but the whole plant is going to die.
Thomas, does snow cover change that timing of death of the plants?
Well, snow cover helps them survive, no question about that. So if you have more snow cover, you get more survival because they're not experiencing the same amount of cold. So you have the inherent winter hardiness of the plant as one factor. You have how big it is. If it's a rosette still, so there's no swelling of a radish or a turnip, there's no bolting of a mustard or a rapeseed, that's when they're the most winter hardy. Give the maximum for that type of plant, whatever its inherent hardiness is. And then you have the amount of cold that you get. So a couple of years ago we had a very warm winter. This year it's quite a bit colder, so that varies. So there's a lot of factors that go into exactly when they die. But I think for a lot of central New York where you really do get minus 15, that kind of temperatures in the winter, for a long period with snow cover or for short periods with little snow cover, that all of the ones I mentioned will die by spring.
All right, how about then questions from Long Island?
Yes.
Yes, I have one question. Well, we planted rye last year, and sometimes it seemed necessary to apply more than one application of glyphosate to kill it reliably. Are there any concerns with multiple applications of glyphosate either in the same year or in multiple years as for subsequent crop growth?
Not that I know, and especially if the rye is growing well, you should be hitting mostly rye with the spray material. So that will be in the plant. And even though rye will take up the herbicide at lower temperatures than a lot of other things, you do still need the greener tissue for it to be really effective. So the picture I showed where it was the mat of mostly yellow leaves that had gone through the winter, applying it at that point probably wouldn't work very well. It's cold and it's not moving things around in the plant. So it's when it perks up and is green and growing that it's going to start being sensitive to it.
Great. Thanks, Thomas.
I've got one more question from Long Island.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
With our late crops like pumpkins, which is one we want to do a lot of reduced tillage in, is there any cover crop you'd recommend going in and interseeding early on? Because by the time we're done with pumpkins, it's too late for anything but rye.
Yeah.
Any of these others?
That is a real good question. We've been playing around with whether you can use winter canola for that purpose. It stays a rosette longer than the others. That's why we were interested in that one. And we tried putting it on just as the leaves went down from powdery mildew, but we've been using Gladiator pumpkin and a good spray program, so that hasn't really been happening until frost. So it's really been too late for them to grow. It's been well into September by the time that happens, sometimes right at the end of September. But if the mildew's taking out your pumpkin leaves earlier, that may work to broadcast as the leaves go down. We also tried broadcasting, so in our situation before the last cultivation, which isn't what you'd be doing, but just before they start to run, when you can still get through the field to broadcast, thinking that then the leaves cover the ground up, and so they won't grow very much. They'll establish and then they'll sit there. And that does happen. The problem we found is that when the leaves do drop with the frost, that they start to grow pretty well. And so by October 15th and 20th, when you may have a lot of people coming out in your pumpkin patch, they're 6-8 inches tall, and so it looks very nice having these big orange eggs sitting in the greenery, but that's on the tall side of what you would want for a good harvest operation. So it's been a little bit tricky to get those to time right. So it's going to be a very specific where that sort of thing would work. And I haven't tried using annual ryegrass for that purpose, but the same timing, putting it on just before the vines start to run it should establish just fine, but I'm concerned that after the leaves drop that you can get too much growth out of that it'll be too tall for when you're harvesting. If you're picking in early October and sending it to markets, that's obviously less of an issue.
Yeah, I tried the annual rye annual ryegrass, and it just got way too big by October. It was not good. Anu, do we have time for one more question here on Long Island for Thomas?
Yeah, go ahead.
We plant sorghum in the summer as soon as we feel it's fit. Will one of these radishes or other the crops compete with that? We chop it 2 or 3 times during the growing season. When the fall planting time comes for the radish, would it compete with that sorghum if the sorghum was still living?
The sorghum slows way down when it gets cold and becomes pretty uncompetitive. So that was actually fairly early, like mid-September in our Freeville trials this year is when that transition happened. So add 10 days to that, I guess. But the sorghum slows way down. So I could see doing the last chopping of the sorghum. You've got the sorghum leaves that have been decomposing from the previous chopping, so you should have a reasonable amount of nitrogen in the soil from that. But mowing it low that last time, and then once the leaves have broken down enough, no-tilling radish seed into that, they should do fine. They're going to grow vigorously at the temperatures that are too cold for sorghum. So it's a nice segue there that the temperatures become bad for sorghum just at the time they become great for radishes. And the nitrogen from the sorghum becomes available to the radishes.
Great. Thanks, Thomas, and thank you for joining us.